Welcome back. As I thought about this third video and prepared to record it, I realized that it would be good for us to take a step back before I get into the weeds, too far into the details, in talking about the specific giftings that the Spirit has given to the church for the common good. Not just for our own good, but it's for the common good, for human and creational flourishing. That's our common calling. So before getting into the specifics of those unique callings within that common calling, I realized we need to take a step back and paint a bigger picture so that we can capture the big picture playfulness of what's going on in the midst of all this. But also I want to address something that may have surfaced as you listen to the second video. So I'm going to do that first, and then I'm going to paint a picture, a big picture, playful vision of these unique callings. And then in a fourth video, I'm going to look at the specific callings. So forgive me, this is a work in progress, and the Spirit is laying things on my heart and mind as I go that I think will be good as we're constructing this theology of play, developing this theology of play as we think about Pentecost and the birth of the church, the nature and purpose of the church. Thank you for bearing with me in this as we play it out together. In that second video, I wanted to give a big picture vision of the nature and the purpose of the church, and I hope that you caught the spirit of playfulness in it. I didn't use the phrase a whole lot, but essentially the church is to be a new creation community. I used that phrase in the first video, but in the second video I didn't use that phrase a whole lot, and so I want to kind of recover that sense here. The church is to be a new creation community, that we are, the very essence of the church is playful, that we hear God's calling to leap into God's heart, and that as we leap into God's heart, we leap with God into the world, inviting others to leap into his heart and get caught up in that very rhythm and pattern, the ecstasy, the joy, and the love of who God is. We just get caught up in the life of God, the rhythm of God, and pattern our lives after the life of Jesus. There's a rhythm to it. And in the first video, I talked about how these rites of the Eucharist and baptism are playful in their essence, but I forgot to mention that, I hope that you can see that really these are enactments, these are dramas, dramatizations of the very core of our faith. So even the fact that these are, rituals that we observe, there's a playfulness to it because they're dramatizing our faith. We're literally playing it out. And so the big idea is that the church is a playful phenomenon. The nature and purpose of the church, even our mission, even disciple making, we want to view in the frame of our playful God, of God's playful heart. But as I thought about this third video, I wanted to acknowledge something now. During that second video, there may have been a kind of disconnect for you as I was describing the church. Because sadly, the church of today, when we think of the church of today, we often don't think, new creation community. In the words of Sally Canine, a holding environment, nurturing and enabling and enduring. Wow. that mothering care of God, that strong care of God in our midst. The church of today often does not resemble that, and I just want to acknowledge that. If that was going through your heart and mind, I want to honor that experience, that is too often many people's experience of the church, is that kind of the opposite of what I had described, which shows us really how desperately we need to return to recapture the essence of the heart of God, the playfulness, the joy, and the love and the freedom of God. The church of today often doesn't feel like a very free place, I must say. I think if we were honest, some of us would even experience the church, aside from being a holding environment and nurturing, far from that, many people experience it as abusive, hurtful, and wounding instead of caring and nurturing. Sometimes churches can be manipulative in how they relate, in how people relate to each other. Sometimes churches send the message that it's more about the rules than about the freedom of the Spirit, keeping a certain list of do's and don'ts, creating a roster of who's in and who's out. Sometimes churches, far from being a new creation community, sometimes churches get caught up in the spirit of violence that dominates our world, that just spirals over and over and over again. Sometimes Christians are prone to weaponize the faith. And as we get caught up in that spirit of violence which pervades our world, it just keeps spiraling over and over again, we view the church's purpose as engaging in culture wars, even the language. There are many Christians who view the primary purpose of the church as engaging culture wars. And really, can you think of anything less playful than that? That the church boils down to a presence that's at war with the very people and the very world that God loves. Sometimes theology, sometimes we invoke theology in harmful ways. Theology becomes an instrument of division, an instrument used to divide, as opposed to a process that we engage to unite and to reconcile, which is what God wants to do. To reconcile all things, to put an end to the division. Sometimes theology becomes more about the rhetoric of hatred instead of the language of love. Theology should really give us a language of the love of God. When theology employs the rhetoric of hatred, it becomes a non-Christian theology. We cannot call it a Christian theology because the most basic theological statement we can make about God is that God is love. So when we use theology as a rhetoric of hatred, we're not really doing theology in the way of Jesus anymore, where the language is the language of love. And so this is all speaking to what the church is called to be and to do in the world, and what we are called to avoid, to resist these tendencies in our midst. So what I'm hoping to do is recall us to this original vision of God, what's on God's heart for a new creation community. And it's a call for us to embrace the spirit of change, of new life, of new birth. You know, as I think about the word church, for some people it isn't even as negative as I have described here. But for many people, for most people, I would say, when they hear the word church, they think of it as, oh, that's the place that you go to on a certain day of the week for a certain time to do a certain thing. Church becomes an event-based place for us. And can you see, I hope that you can see that when we think of church in that way, what we're essentially doing is we're kind of trying to put God's heart and God's mind and God's vision for the church in a box. We're extremely limiting what God has in mind for God's people. The church isn't an event-based place. The church is a new creation community. And that is so much bigger and grander and more playful and free and creative than simply a place that we go to once a week for a certain event during a certain time. Church in God's heart and mind is so much more playful and bigger than that. And so the invitation here is for us to play even with our idea of church and how we go about being this new creation community. This is something that I have experienced myself when I was starting new churches in Europe. At one point, this church that we were starting in Madrid, called Mountain View, at one point we started to have our weekly services. You know, that's what happens when you're starting a church. You kind of get to the point where you say, okay, now we're going to start our weekly services. And what we realized after about 4, 5, 6 months into that was that the church programs, the church services were actually hindering us from being this new creation community, this community leaping into the heart of God, who's leaping into the world, inviting more people to leap into the heart of God. That the church services were hindering our ability to actually be able to do that, the programs, the activities. In fact, church sometimes can become not very restful, can become an exhausting and tiring place, can't it? Because it's like churches just get so busy and keep people in such a cycle of busyness that then it becomes not very restful, which isn't very playful, is it? It's exhausting, it's tiring. Well, when we're really playing, it's not exhausting or tiring. We feel like we could, you know. So that's what we had discovered. So what we decided to do as a church was we said, you know what? We're not going to do weekly church services. We're not going to get caught up in that cycle of exhaustion We want to have kind of a healthy balance as a church so that we can be more available for people. We can be more available to the world. We can be more present to people. And so that we can really rest into the rhythms of God, the unforced rhythms of grace, and invite people to get caught up in, as Eugene Peterson says in his paraphrase of Jesus saying in Matthew 11, to get caught up in the unforced rhythms of grace is how he puts it. And so you can see right there that we tried to recapture a sense of that creativity, and we felt free to improvise. What we were really trying to do, although I didn't realize it at the time, was we were playing with our idea of the church. And the Spirit sets us free to do that. There's no one way to go about being the people of God. There's no one single prescription for it. We're free to improvise, to be creative, and to just be together as the people of God in the world in a spirit of joy in love. We're really free. That's the vision I hope you can capture in all of this. And so you can see that this new creation community has this common calling that I described, a lot of it I described in the second video. This calling to leap into the heart of God, to be on mission with God, to make disciples. And I left out another one, but it's our calling to steward and care for creation. So this extends not just, the calling of God extends not just to the human creation, but to all of creation, that we are to steward and care for creation as well. That's our common calling. That's something that all Christians, as the church collective, that we are called to be about, to be a redemptive presence in the world and to serve the common good. It's another way of putting it. We're here to serve the common good. But within that, we have unique callings, unique giftings or charisms. And so this is where the work of the people of God, is expressed through these unique charisms. We each have a unique, another way of putting it is, we each have a unique vocation. Within the common vocation that I've identified, we each have a unique way of expressing that through a unique vocation. And I like that word vocation because it carries two meanings that together form a playful kind of a reality here. The first meaning of the word vocation, it means voice. It comes from the Latin voce, which is where we get our word vocation from. So like when you're singing a piece of music, sometimes you'll see a little note that says sotto voce, right? Sotto voce. That little note is telling us, beyond just the strict notes that you see on the page, the strict way of singing it, that little note is telling us what voice, what quality the music should have, the kind of the essence of the song. It's conveying the essence of it beyond just the strict notation that's on the stanza there. It's giving us the inner essence of it, and that's what voice is. You know, when you hear someone's voice, you capture a sense of the kind of person that they are. You know, you can hear different voices. I can even hear different voices of people at our table. And I think, Jen's voice has a certain quality to it. Diane's voice sounds this way. Denise's voice sounds a different way. Anne's voice sounds, another way. Carol's voice sounds this way. Each person has a unique voice that when you hear it, you say, that's that person. And you hear something, you catch something of what that person is like just by the sound of their voice. Voice conveys essence. It conveys being, who you are. And so vocation, when we find our unique vocation within that common vocation, there's a sense of, this is who I am. I'm free to be me. I'm gifted in a particular way. And you're just free, and the creativity flows, and there's joy. And ironically, you're able to really forget about yourself, because when you're using your gifts, you're focusing on other people in that way. And you're just being yourself in it. And it's just so like play. That when we find that sense of vocation, it has a playful, joyful quality to it. Our work feels like play. And it even feels restful. We just feel like, what other people think, that looks really hard. To us, it just feels like natural and restful. And so that's that first sense of vocation. It's conveying this idea of voice, of personhood, of identity, of being, of essence. But then the second concept of vocation is, as we think about this idea of gifting, is work. It's just simply work. We use the word vocation in connection with someone's work. And so the reason I wanted to talk about that first meaning so much is because this is helping us to get at the spirit of play and playfulness in connection with the idea of gifts and charism and our work, the work that God calls us to do in the world. And we see it exemplified in the creation. You'll notice that in creation, vocation is when your voice and your work become one. When who you are and what you do are unified. When your doing proceeds from your being. And we see this in the very creation account, that God's voice and God's work are one and the same thing. That as God spoke, it came into existence. And that creation actually flows out of who God is. That what God made is out of the overflow of the joy and the love of God, the very leaping of God. And so God's being and God's doing are one and the same. There's a union of voice and work. And that's what God desires for us as individuals, that there's a union between who we are and what we do. That's vocation. And that is God's ultimate calling. The way I like, Frederick Buechner puts it is so wonderful here, as he writes in his book, Wishful Thinking, which is a kind of a glossary of faith. He has an entry for the word vocation. And in this entry, he conveys this sense that I am describing here. He defines vocation this way. He says, the place where God calls you is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. The place where God calls you is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. That is vocation. That is our calling. That is the work that God has given you to do uniquely. And do you see how beautiful this is? That God has designed gifting in such a way that the very thing that gives you so much joy and gladness, that you just love to do, that you want to do, that you're free to do, that you are creative in, that you feel blessed to do, is the very same thing that blesses others. The source of your greatest blessing is the thing that God uses to bless others. So then there's a certain restfulness to the work that you do. To the acts of service that you offer to God and to others and to our world. There's a restfulness to it. You see how the spirit of play is in this very concept of gifting, the big idea of it here? And so, by the way, I have seen this at work in our table. That each of you in your uniqueness, in the different ways that you approach the world, the different experiences that you have, the different gifts that you bring to the table, you're bringing your voice to the table. And as you are offering just your authentic self, your real self, who you are, that is the very gift. The offering of your authentic self, who you really are deep in your being, that is the very gift that God is using to touch your table companions' lives, to speak to their hearts, to fill the hunger that is in our souls. Wow! God has done such an amazing work. Our God is so creative and wonderful, isn't he? Wow. Well, I want to pause there now. I invite you to just reflect on that. And when we come back, then I will look at our unique callings and giftings as we continue to reimagine what it means to be God's new creation people and to live into God's playful heart for us and for all of creation.